Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured in return. And why beholdest thou the speck that is in thy brother's eye?
Oh, I got to put a fade on that one. Good morning. Welcome to the Line by Line Bible Studies. My name is Paul Strangini. And it's a beautiful Monday morning coming to you from Northwest Illinois. From rural Northwest Illinois, where... There we go. Oh... It was a rough start this morning. So we are in chapter 7, verse 24. Let's just start. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him to a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And let's read the contrary. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened to a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And that's the end of the thing. So, he uses a simple analogy to demonstrate two sides of a simple idea that in listening to him, we have not fulfilled or taken to ourselves the benefit that we might accrue by more effectively. I don't know why I'm using such huge words first thing in the morning. More effectively, if we would also put those things into practice. He's saying hearing without doing, and this is a theme you find throughout the Bible, especially the New Testament. Well, in the Old Testament, you definitely get the idea of the rock. The Lord is our rock. He is our salvation. I remember we used to sing the song, the hymn, the old hymn, on Christ the solid rock I stand, all their ground is shifting sand. A very simple analogy, but it's kind of like a flood analogy, right? That doing the things he says will result in us having the stability and being founded upon something stable, which will enable us to endure all the tribulations and difficulties of life. Whereas listening, but not doing them, meaning we listen to the words of Christ, but we do not make it part of our lives. You know, I'm not saying, and again, oftentimes the scriptures speak in absolute terms, and certainly we want to follow his word absolutely. Whenever we fail to, like, just very simply, what are the things he's talking about? I mean, it's Monday. Last week was a while ago. The weekend's been here and gone. And what is it that he says we ought to do? Well, do unto, what all things, therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. Every time you do that, every time you violate that, you fail to do what he says we ought to do. Every time you fail that, you are placing yourself in danger. Every time, we're angry with our brother, with or without a cause, especially without a cause, especially in an unjustifiable, especially in a self-serving way, right? A lot of anger is just self-serving. I'm hurt. I'm offended. Something has been taken from me. It's all about me, me, me. Your anger is a little more, I mean, without a cause, it's a little more justified, let's say, when they hurt someone else, when it's directed at something other than you. And, Paul, you're trying to justify anger. Well, in the sense that anger must be justified, because the Lord describes himself, or the prophets and the Lord himself have described God in anger. And that's an anthropomorphism, but still, it means there's a justifiable side to things. But we ought not seek to justify ourselves continually in anger, because it's a trap. It causes us to sin. We should rather seek peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. So making peace. So when we fail to do what he has commanded, all these things, we are putting our lives at risk. And you see that in the floods, in the story of the flood. Because the whole world, every thought and imagination of men's hearts was only evil continually. And then the flood came and took them all away. And it's funny, people really get up in arms about the flood. On one hand, you had fundamentalists. They are always trying to prove the technical existence of a worldwide flood. On the other hand, you have the skeptics always trying to rub it in their face about how there's a million and one ways to disprove the flood, about the animals and this, that, the other. They are both caught up in the technicalities of the flood, and they're both essentially fundamentalist positions. But neither side takes into account the story of the flood. What's the moral of the story? And as I argued with someone, I'm like, look at today, if we fill our hearts, if any society or world fills their minds and imaginations with only evil continually, and the earth becomes filled with violence, the flood will come and take us all away too. You can count on it. God promised there will be no flood again, no flood to cover the earth with water, but there will be a flood. Just like Jesus describes. The rain's going to come, the wind's going to blow, and everything's going to it's all going to be knocked down, it's all going to be destroyed. Everything that we've built, if we don't give heed to the things that Jesus taught, it can happen individually, and it can happen to the whole world. And then there'll be very few left, I mean, you don't think of flood. We could have a nice little flood of nuclear fallout. And 100 years after that, see how many humans are still walking around. Oh, there'll be a few. Just want a little coffee. The rains descend, the floods came. That's also, I'm getting ahead of myself. I love to get ahead of myself. I was listening to someone, a friend, leading a Bible study this weekend, or it's from like last month. I was listening to it, and I thought, how disciplined. Because there's never been a rabbit hole I didn't just immediately jump down. But there's differences of style for everything, It's good to be disciplined, and sometimes it's good not to be disciplined. But, well, it depends on what you're talking about. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew, and beat upon that house. And notice that in both cases, though I use the flood analogy. Well, look at Noah got beat upon too. The rains came down on him. But he was inside the ark, which was what? Following what God had said. God had said, do these things. He was doing what God told him, and therefore was spared. And also, Jesus is saying here, if we listen to what he says and act on those things, our lives will be founded upon a rock, and therefore we will not be I won't say subject. We could be subject to it, but we will not be, let's say, overcome of any adversity that comes our way. And that's what that storm analogy is for. It's for whatever happens to come. There's all kinds of things that could come. There's all kinds of problems in life. Life is filled with difficulty, and it's impossible except that tribulation, trouble is going to come into your life. And you don't want to have filled your life with all the being. I mean, think about the things Jesus has been asking. People. What is he told you to do? That's so difficult. I mean, there are difficult things. You think about it. The things like he says, for instance, turn the other cheek. That's not such an easy thing. We're much more concerned with our rights. I'm concerned about rights. The freedom to speak, right? But the thing is, it's not so much. I'm not so concerned. I am concerned myself personally, okay? But I should not be so concerned with the right to speak as I should be concerned with my obligation to speak, whether or not anyone wants to let me talk or not. You can have all the right to speak you want, right? But if you don't have the courage to actually speak when the time comes to speak, if we don't speak, then eventually we won't have rights to speak. And then we'll have to speak under adversity. And there's a lot of pressure not to. And when you get to the point where it's like they're starting to say, no, you can't say that. And they already do say that. I mean, if you want to work anywhere, you can't talk about some things, or it's not that what in the whole world, like even on YouTube right here where I'm streaming, because they're censoring people, they're kicking people off because they say outrageous things. But here's the thing. One man's outrage is another man's gospel. And if I start saying outrageous things, if I start saying the things I say and think may be outrageous to some people, there are definitely people who would be outraged at the things I have to say. Like the things I say about predestination, that causes outrage among people who believe in free will. And they say, you make God a monster, and they get really angry. Or at least they sound angry in their writing. I don't know if I want to attribute anger to them. They're believers after all. But so we can give offense. It's impossible not to give offense to people in some way as far as differences of opinion. But if you know a bunch of people believe one way, sometimes you censor yourself. You don't speak. Sometimes it's not necessary. It's like, maybe I know they all believe a certain way, but like I'm in an entirely the wrong venue, to start talking about that. It'd be like me getting up, like doing a wedding ceremony and starting to talk about things that are controversial. As much as I may want to, there's something in me that was like, there's that a streak in me that wants to rebuke people to their faces. It is foolish to build your house upon the sand. What does the sand represent? Well, it represents not doing what Jesus says. But what does that bring about? If we don't do what Jesus says, what do we have? We are following our whims and passions. And you see a lot of that in the world today. That we're not allowed to give defense to people as they seek after their whims and passions, as they cross boundaries into behaviors that have been traditionally rejected as abnormal, as not beneficial to society. Just like I'm always, I'm not as quick to condemn people of like certain, like homosexuals and stuff. I've always sort of like, I dislike things like the, what is the name of it? That Baptist church. Oh, I can't remember their name. And it's on the tip of my brain. Pastor P something. No, it's not P. What? Phelps and it's Phelps and his church. That's good enough to get his name right. Okay, like I just like that sort of. But the thing is, it's like we're all crossing over into. I mean, Jesus talked about looking with your eyes on to lust after a woman. You've already committed adultery with her in your heart. When we start just blurring the boundaries of what is correct as far as in society as a whole, the foundations of our entire society become founded on sand also, because there's no bedrock of the family and of right and wrong, and of and of drawing the lines. Where is the center of where the center of the world is, and where are the margins? Where are the things that have been pushed off, the marginal? Because that's where that stuff belongs, at the margins of society, not at the center of it. That's destructive. But today it's at the center. It's being exalted. All the corrupt, abominable things of the world, certainly in regards to sex, it's all being like pulled to the center of society and elevated into a position of glorification. And you see it just wreaking havoc with young people's minds. It's very difficult. You want to raise kids today, it's very difficult. You have to be it's weird because you don't want to be overprotective, but on the other hand, there are some things you need. There are certain ideas you want to protect them from being indoctrinated into. You know what I mean? It's one thing to let kids take risks and let them be challenged. It's another thing to immerse them in evil. And so if you send your kids to school, let me say this: you've really it's extremely important that you form a strong relationship with them outside of school and talk to them, especially starting young. Do not just let them watch TV and be separate from you like that and have such a distinct life and give him his dinner in front of the TV or in his room and all their life is with their peers and online and all that stuff. You need to be engaged with them a lot, especially if you send them to school. I mean, you should engage with your kids no matter what. But you send them to school, you understand they are being poisoned. And so you have to, when they're not in school, you better be really on the ball. You've got like an extra burden there. You have to undo. My dad was good at undoing the things of school to some degree, like making me like sort of aware of attempts to indoctrinate me. And one of the ways he did that was he kind of talked about the communists and how they would indoctrinate their children, the schools, into like telling on their parents and informing on them. Are your parents are listen to listen to the radio at night, and what do they listen to? And if they listen to stuff that is kind of revolutionary, well, you should let us know, and or whatever. And instilling in them a sense of loyalty. But to do that, you have to form a real relationship. Unlike the threefold, rain descended, floods came, the winds blew. It's very poetic and beautiful. The house fell, and great was the fall of it. Man, you ever watch homes knocked over by the weather? That's kind of like I don't know. Yeah, every time there's a hurricane, there's like all these homes destroyed, all these beachfront properties. It's like, it seems like the reason is actually we have too many people living on the beaches because they subsidize the insurance. The government subsidizes the insurance, so it's much cheaper to live on the beach than it probably should be, because the insurance should be astronomical to encourage people not to build houses on the sand, because it's essentially what it is. And then we gotta come in and help them rebuild. Not that I don't have compassion, but on the other hand, there should be, there should be like some sort of You get in and interfere with things, you end up creating more problems for everybody. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these things, the people were astonished at his doctrine. For he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. I remember my old teacher, Arnold Murray, used to make a big deal about this verse. I guess because he liked to teach with authority. As one having authority, this says this is and I was like, well, I don't teach as Jesus taught, because I'm not Jesus. I don't have authority. Maybe the things you'll hear me kind of speak with authority when I talk about how you ought to raise your kids. I say it pretty definitively, don't I? I don't say like, oh, well, maybe. Now, that's the thing, is that the Pharisees will say things like, well, on one hand this and one on that. It's not entirely a slam on the Pharisees. I teach like that sometimes because I don't have the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, while some people may prefer, when they teach, to just always be like absolutely sure about a question, and then maybe I suffer by comparison, because I say sometimes one or the other, because I don't have the fullness of understanding. I'm also a much younger man. I'm only 44. I never saw like Arnold Murray teaching before he was in his 60s. I think I saw him in his late 50s. This stuff has the 80s. I can't do the math. I don't really want to, honestly. So let's not. Whatever. That's the first person I studied with was a man named Arnold Murray. He's kind of famous late night TV preacher. Not a preacher so much as a teacher. And like I said, he's the one who's just authority. And then he always taught everything with such authority, even the things that he was wrong about, And Jesus has the authority. And that was the thing, is that he taught as one whom God had given authority to speak definitively, instead of like, well, on one hand this and on one hand that. And I would say that, using authority for authority's sake, for me, to just teach as one having authority, I can't think of anything so foolish of me to do, unless God had come down and said to me, Paul, I give you authority, to speak boldly things that you aren't certain about. You know what I mean? To act certain when you are not certain. To act bold when you ought not, because you really are only half-baked. Or to act bold and authoritative. And this is a thing that infects a lot of, I think, preaching in the world. To act bold and authoritative, even though your only authority comes from the fact that you're in a denomination and they say exactly what the doctrines are. I mean, that's a certain form of authority. You've been given authority from a bunch of other people who say, this is the truth. We all agree, so you go take it. Unfortunately, that's happened dozens and dozens of times, and they do not all agree in every point. So every point is not of the same weight of authority. Like there's obviously some authority in it, right? Especially when you look across the greatest number of denominations and see things that are found to be universally true among Christians, or nearly universally true, like things like the Trinity or something like that. Even so, though, that's not a measure of what the truth is, meaning just consensus opinion. Someone pulled consensus on me. That's not a rational way. Just the consensus is not. I mean, at one time the consensus was the earth is flat, and some people on YouTube are still trying to prove the earth is flat. And so therefore, and from where we stand, it is flat, and the sun is up, and it goes over the sky, and all that. That's all just a subjective observation. It's not meant to be an objective scientific observation. But authority for authority's sake, or feigning authority because you think it's sort of Christ-like, don't do that. I did, and I think it was foolish. Okay, that is foolish. Well, because I was taught that that's how you should be. Or it wasn't said, Paul, that's how you should be. But what it was said is I saw it that behavior being modeled. And I'm like, well, if I say the same things that guy says with authority, then I have authority. And I think that's true, generally speaking. Like if Jesus says something and I understand it, I tend to speak with authority. Like, no, that's what it says. But God knows I've been wrong, you know. And God knows where I'm still wrong, but I don't. So the use of authority, meaning with authority, you know what I mean? Because it has that sense of, not that he, you know, it's not really speaking to whether or not he actually has authority, but it's saying he spoke as one who did have authority. I mean, with a commanding and with a certain commanding certitude. Like he knew what he was talking about. At this time, let me take a moment to encourage you to subscribe to Line by Line Bible Studies. And click on the little bell so that you get notifications whenever we're streaming, which is Monday through Friday, 7 to 8 a.m. approximately. And of course, I keep talking about doing other specials, which I've only done 1 or 2. But that will come about. But I have hundreds of hours of studies on oraclesofgod.org. And of course, I have my longtime YouTube page. If you have a question about this study, you can post it in the pop-out chat. I keep calling it a pop-out chat, but it's not. It's just the chat. I call it the pop-out chat because I pop the thing out. That's just to the right there, and I can say, you know, you can write your question there if it's about this study, and I can write my, you know, little... There we go. I wrote a little something in there. Hello, world. But if you have a question that goes deeper, or you're listening to this later and that chat is gone, you can send them to questions@oraclesofgod.org, which I check on at least a weekly basis. You can send in your suggestions for studies you think I might do or whatever. And you can leave questions in the comments section below. But if, you know, YouTube is not really spectacular about notifying me when I have a question, when I have comments. And the more comments that begin to go in, the more difficult it's going to be to track that. I've certainly had on my other channel things where, like, I got comments and then I didn't notice them for months. There was like a question and I felt bad. Because I don't want it to seem like I'm ignoring anybody. I don't do that. Or never intentionally. Sometimes by reason of time or whatever. Not time so much as just I have a very full schedule, etc. And some questions are difficult. They take, you know, it could take me a couple hours to answer things. And so it's like, yeah, well, next time I got a couple hours, I'll be right in there. And I want to, but that's the way it goes. So we finished chapter 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Look at that. The Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important things Jesus taught. Certainly people point to it, people talk about it, but now we have examined what it has to say. And, you know, God knows we could go on. We could go back over it again and come up with new things to say about it. And that's what I just did. I mean, I've been over it before, again and again. There's always something fresh and new. You know, when we just open our minds to the Spirit and open our Bibles. But it takes, you know, it takes some effort to do that. So let's look at chapter 8, verse 1. When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said unto him, See thou tell no man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. There is a extensive procedure in the book of, oh boy, well, let's say in the law being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but specifically probably Leviticus or Deuteronomy. There is a procedure for the cleansing of a leper, or not cleansing, they don't cleanse lepers, but for the priest to inspect the leprosy. Now, it's funny, as I'm sitting here, I'm like, what do I know about a leprosy? Is it a virus? Is it an infection of some sort? I don't know what leprosy is. Well, most diseases are, it's not genetic because it's supposedly highly contagious, so that makes you think it's like something viral. Or what? I don't know. What is leprosy? Darn it, I'm going to find out. You know, I just asked that question as if I'm helpless. Let's see, leprosy. The problem is my desk is just a little too, like the microphone has to go here. Leprosy. Good thing I like. It's an infection. Okay. So leprosy is an infection of a bacteria. So that makes sense. They would have like something come up and that looks like leprosy, and they'd show themselves to the priest. And when and if it went away, they'd have to keep showing it to them to prove that whether it was still there or not. There's just like a go to the priest and have him look at it, and so there was, as in Moses' law, there was a procedure that they were to go through if they had leprosy, or if they thought they were cleansed of leprosy. My throat's getting dry here, buds. It's like you get up and then you run around getting everything ready, and then you talk for a half hour straight and your throat just dries up. So, any case, so there's this procedure, and Jesus says when he's cleansed to go and show him. You know, I always think that I've tried of late, of recent years, to take I always try to look at the Bible in new ways. I need like another piece of paper up there because like, get down underneath the sunlight. There we go. I'm like really slouched down in my chair. So anyways, there's like, you think like the positioning of stories in the Bible is probably important. And generally I breeze over miracles because I've generally had not much to say about them. But I'm going to try to look at them differently. Because again, like I said, I think far too often I've allowed sort of the fundamentalist perspective of, and that is basically to just look at this as a literal event. Not that it isn't literal. I believe in the miracles of Jesus because I believe Jesus had the power of God, right? But their greatest concern was like, the miracle, the literal event. Not thinking that they're in this story, there might be more of a deeper truth. You know, like I was saying with the flood, they get so caught up in like, well, you know, is the ark big enough? What's the geology say? And how would he feed the animals, and you know, all kinds of rigmarole that all has to do with the literal side of the story. And if you believe the stories literally, there's really no further, you know, we don't need it. Why do I need it? Like, he actually healed. Of course, we believe this. So what else can we learn from it besides an historical event happened? You know, is that really the extent of it? Because that's the way two groups of people I don't agree with look at the story exclusively. They're looking at it, or for the most part, is they look at it as like, This is an event, and they look at it as a literal event, which is fine, but that's the only way they see it. So this man is unclean. He's got, that's what they would talk about leprosy. I remember learning from people that the lepers had to go around declaring themselves unclean to people. There's the unclean, unclean, so people could get away from them. So these are the most shunned people. I mean, they have an infectious disease that you can catch from contact with them. I don't think it's like a question of like, I don't think it's like an airborne type of thing. I think it's a contact type of thing. I believe like there has to be some sort of physical contact or very close proximity. Of course, also their clothing, it's bacteria. It could be all over everything. But also, you know, you probably have to have a break in your own skin for the bacteria to get in there, and it's a long, slow moving infection from what I understand. In fact, I read the definition of leprosy, but I did not. Now, leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, is a long-term infection by the bacterium, blah, 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 blah. Initially, infections are without symptoms and typically remain that way for 5 to 20 years. It's sort of like dormant. I need a piece of paper up there. Maybe I can pull that off. Now we'll just leave it. Maybe if I sit forward. Maybe that helps. Nah. I just don't like having the sun in my eyes, as I'm sure you can understand. All right, let's just hunker down a bit. There we go. Just kind of today I'll get that paper after the study. That hurts my elbow. Okay. Now I gotta crouch down. So we have someone here. He is the sort of the quintessential outcast, the leper, shunned by everyone. And he's coming down from the mountain from this moment. You know, he's up in the mountain. And that imagery. Now, we looked at the particulars of his teaching. Let's look at the imagery of this and the symbolism. Jesus is up on the mountain. That's meant to point right back to Moses. Moses went up into the mountain to where the swirling smoke and the darkness was, and God was up in the mountain, and he went there and received the law. Now, Jesus has gone up into the mountain, and out of his own mouth he has spoken the law. But now he is, like I said, when he said, I didn't come to destroy but fulfill, and really make stronger the law, because now he is making the law according to the Spirit and not just according to the letter. So it's an important change. Not really a change, though, I would say, because it's always been there underneath the surface, in the spirit of the law. There was always, I think that it was always intended to be more than just, thou shalt not kill meant something else. And it had the golden rule is in the law. I forgot the exact verse, but I'm not going to take time to look that up now. But believe me, the sentiment is contained within the law and in the prophets. I forgot. Maybe it's in the prophets specifically. But those understood that you should do to other people what you would have them do unto you. And that's in all the law, really. If you think about it, the reason it exists is because of our conscience. Because of the sense of like, well, if I was a stranger, I would want to be treated with hospitality. And so there was all kinds of rules of hospitality. And there we go, sorry. So we have a leper, the most shunned person. And Jesus is coming down off the mountain of God. Moses came down off the mountain of God. And he had to put a veil over his head because of the glory that was on him. Sometimes mistranslated horns, because I think that the Hebrew words are similar and probably have the same root. But I think the idea of glory and horns actually makes sense. Though I don't know. Because it means, because a horn is like when we see a ray of the sun, it looks like a horn. It is an emanation of power and just as glory is like a thing that goes out. It's in a way obviously not really a thing. I mean, it's not. It is an impression given to people at a distance of the magnitude of something, of how great it is. So it is. It's like admiration, perhaps. You don't have to admire to behold glory. All the earth is going to behold the glory of the Lord, and it's not going to make everybody happy. So Moses had this glory on himself. His face shone, and they had to cover it with a veil. And the people hid their faces from him. And a leper is kind of like that. He always has to hide themselves, and they were, if you've seen in certain movies like Ben-Hur, where his mother and sister are infected with leprosy, they wrap themselves up and they kind of hit at the margins of the society. So he's going to the very most marginal person in that society, the person pushed off to the very edge of life and existence, existing at the very edges of things. He's coming down from the mountain of God, so to speak, and the first thing he encounters is the person whose life is shattered. And this person worships him and says, "If you will, you can make me clean again." And what's that signify? He has this infection, but the idea of infection, what he's been talking about, is like sort of a moral deficiency in our lives. That it's like a corruption. In the Pharisees' doctrine, there had been a lot of corruption brought in. That Israel is like a leprous man. That the people have become corrupt by these teachings, which are letter of the law, meaning, well, I didn't kill, I don't kill a man, but I have a heart full of hatred. I don't commit adultery, but I look after women all the time because it's not unrighteous. And the worst part is not so much that they were doing the sins as they were counting themselves guiltless. It's one thing to say, it's one thing to lust after a woman in your heart and say, I confess that is wrong and that's unrighteous of me. It's another thing to say, I can do that as often as I like because it's not adultery. And that's the difference. And that's what he's saying, is that the things that, if you don't do the things I say, if you don't look at the law the way I see it, then your house is built on sand. And you're in danger of destruction. And through this adherence to these bad doctrines, the whole society has become corrupted. Like this leprous man. And he's saying, and he's looking at him and saying, you can make things right. You're the one who can make the world right again, Lord Jesus. And he says, so if you will, you can make things right with me. You can cleanse me of this corruption, this infection. And so he touches him and says, I will, then be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And then so he gives him this command to go, don't go telling people, but go rather to the priest. So he's taken the most marginal person in their society, or one of the most, right? Someone who can be reasonably defined as someone who is unclean, filthy. Unclean. You understand? In the Old Testament, clean and unclean was such a big deal, and it really is kind of in our own minds too. We have a clean and unclean. We try to keep the things separate, right? Or we ought to. This is why we have toilets and we have plumbing and all that. So the priest represents the cleanest thing, and he exists at the center of the society in the temple. He's taking the thing that's at the very edge of the world, so to speak, of their world. This person who is like almost not a member of society. He's probably a Jew and a leper, but that's the only thing that even keeps him still part of their world. He's not a Gentile. Otherwise, it would be remarked. When he encounters Gentiles, it always is. So, he is existing at the very edges of society. Jesus comes, and with his doctrine, he heals him, cleanses him, and sends him to the middle. Sends him to... Don't stop along the way to talk to other people about your experience, but go right to the place where it matters most for a testimony against them, or unto them. Sorry, not against them. That comes later. That they could see they could see this, and because it's significant, because these people are despised and shunned. They are despised and shunned. Because another thing that should be mentioned about the way that the Pharisees looked at things, I don't remember if this comes out. Well, I know in John it definitely comes out, but it's a fact that they looked on, like, if some evil befalls you, they looked on it as a result of your sin. So, like, if you got leprosy, you must have done something sinful. And we've all sinned. I mean, of course we've done something sinful. But you must have done something really bad to end up with leprosy. People still act that way today. Even though Jesus thoroughly rebuked that idea. Even though the book of Job is all about that idea. I remember some guy, atheist, saying that we should eliminate the book of Job from the Bible. I'm like, are you kidding? Because of what it portrays. They don't like the story of like all the bad things that happened to Job. I'm like, well, that's life. And the point of the book is that none of this happened to him for any reason like he'd done anything wrong. Because bad stuff can happen to you in life without you doing anything wrong. Without you being a particularly sinful person. You know what I mean? You don't have to be particularly sinful to have a horrible disease. And we understand that today. I think today, because of Christianity, our society is much more piteous upon people with diseases. Whereas, I always think it's funny when atheists try to suggest you could build a moral society similar to this one based on just pure rationality and atheism. Yeah. Every time that's tried, you end up first, let's start by aborting every unfit baby. Let's put the sick out of their misery, because the resources in their lives aren't really worth living, are they? That really ticks me off sometimes. It's like, who asked you? I mean, it's like people who are whole look on those who are not whole, and they say their lives aren't worth living. Whereas you ask those people, sometimes people with the worst kinds of diseases, they do love to be alive, happy to share in life. And as terrible as it is, and it might be that they do not get to enjoy life the way you enjoy it, who the hell are you to say that their life isn't worth living? That's what I'd like to know. So, they would look down on someone like this as being cursed by God. The lepers are cursed by God. But now Jesus comes down with them on the first thing he does is cleanses a leper. Someone who they would see as cursed. They would see them as sort of unworthy of this. Because they must have done something terrible to warrant this punishment in the first place. And a lot of Christians still believe that kind of mentality. Because it's a sort of a superstition that people just generally have. They think that whenever something bad happens to someone, it has to have been... They have to have made it happen somehow. Right? For them to deserve it. Because they look at the world in terms of... you have to deserve everything that happens to you. When the truth is, we all deserve much worse than we get. What we fail to see is that we don't deserve the good things we have right now. You know what I mean? Like, we all deserve to be lepers. We all deserve to be, there's no, like, we deserve to be whole. We deserve to have sound limbs and functional bodies and good lives. We don't deserve that. And to walk around proudly thinking, I deserve this, and this person is a sinner, so they deserve to be a leper. It's so gratifying to the self, but it's just absolutely, we just did the Sermon on the Mount, and I mean, come on, that can't be the right attitude. That isn't like I said, the poor in spirit. That's someone who's pretty rich in spirit. I'm so full of it, you know. Oh, is the sun gone? There we go. I want to set up. That's not comfortable. All right. Just adjust that upwards. Okay. All right. So, the gift that Moses commanded, you know, when you were cleansed of your leprosy, you were supposed to offer a gift, which was some form of sacrifice. Not all sacrifices were blood. Sometimes it was like things like grain or meal or whatever. But a lot of times Jesus says, don't tell anybody. It's not a strict commandment like never speak a word of this. But what he's saying is, you know, the temptation of people might be to just start gabbing about it. You know, just go, don't, you know, just look at, I'm cleansed. I got to go tell my friends and my mother. But see, the reason he does this is, like I said, because he wants them to go directly from the unholy, unclean place at the edge of society, directly to the center of their world, to the priest, and show yourself to him as a testimony to them that the lepers are cleansed and the margins are pressing in on you. The things you have despised are the things that are now, you're going to have to deal with things you have hitherto treated badly, or they've been pushed off to the edges. The world is going. There's a change coming in this world. Jesus is bringing change. So how much time we got? Oh, 4 minutes. I started a little late. Let's give it a shot. Verse 5, and when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion beseeching him, and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. And Jesus said unto him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this man, go, and he goeth. And to another, come, and he cometh. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled and said unto them that followed, Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. This is too long a section. Maybe even though I started on time, I'll say a little bit about this, because it's like, there's no way I'm going to be able to encompass all of this. But I'm just going to relate it back to the last part. You know, first we saw the leper cleansed. And, you know, he's a marginal figure. You know what I mean by the margin? Like, if you think of their world as being centered around the temple and the worship, place of worship there, that is like, they had to go up every year to Jerusalem, or occasionally, or whatever, for the Passover. They had to go to there to make the sacrifice. They had to go up all the time to the center of their world, Jerusalem. And at the center of the center is the holy place in the temple, where the priests are and all these things. And that is the center of their world. And then, but that's the place someone like the leper, he can't even go in there. Or, yeah, and he can't. I mean, he could go show himself to the priest. They could approach to some degree. He's cleansed now, so I don't know how exactly. But, I mean, he definitely isn't going to come into the Holy of Holies. I mean, he's sending the unclean to the clean. And notice the reference, I have not found so great faith not in Israel. Now he's going to a centurion, Which at first I was thinking in my mind, I'm like, is this I was assuming he was a Gentile, but I thought, well, maybe that's not safe to assume, because the Roman army could take in people from all the different nations. It would be, so a Jew could become a soldier and a centurion. A centurion is someone who is over 100 people, so like that's like a captain or probably a captain, not a lieutenant. Maybe even, I don't know, whatever. A centurion was over 100. And, is that right? Wait, centurion. And then they had a phalanx is Greek. Gosh, my head is so far out of ancient warfare. A legion, a legionnaire was, yeah, okay. So that's not a legionnaire. But a centurion. Okay. So it's not a very high rank, so it could, I thought it could be a Jew, but then when he says not in Israel, I tend to think this is a Gentile. But even if he was in Israel, of a Jewish heritage, he also would have been seen as an outcast, serving under the army of occupation, serving under the army of the Romans. That would be considered another marginal figure. Of course, now the Gentiles are not just marginal figures; they're like the other on the outside of the boundaries of their society. They are they are excluded from the Commonwealth of Israel. Obviously, they're not part of their nation. And this one, and he says to him, Jesus enters into Capernaum, which is the city he begins his ministry in this area. That's where it's he dwelt in the area about Capernaum, and there comes to him a centurion, asking him, my servant lies at home sick of the palsy. He's tormented. So he says, I will come. So first we have this marginal figure coming to Jesus as he's coming off the mountain. Now he returns back to his home, and this outsider comes and asks him to heal his servant. And Jesus indicates a willingness to go to his house, which is something that's got to be remarked on, because the Jews did not enter into the houses of Gentiles. Because of the fearfulness of becoming unclean, because the Gentiles were not, they didn't follow all the Jewish restrictions, and there was something important, and there is something important about keeping things separate, distinguishing between the clean and the unclean, distinguishing between the inside and the outside. I mean, it's like everyone makes this distinction as far as family. Your family is your family, and strangers outside of that group are not in that circle, right? There's a need to keep categories distinct. And, in Christ it says there is neither Jew nor Greek nor male nor female, because we're talking about a spiritual kingdom and the kingdom of God. But in the world, there are categories. But I think the transition that's made in the New Testament is not to just destroy all categories because they're wrong, but it's so that we all may enter in together into a new category of distinction, which is God's kingdom. That we could all be citizens of that and part of that thing. But, it's entering into God's kingdom, which is its own sort of nation. And there are those who are excluded from it and outside of it. But God takes in from all diverse backgrounds and nations, and, we may have been lepers and unclean or Gentiles, but he accepts all who, like it says in the book of Acts, all who fear God and follow after righteousness, all who have faith in Christ can enter into that kingdom. And so he offers to go to him whose house it's not lawful, not traditional for them to enter into, for fear of defiling themselves. by going in there. And that may seem very quaint and unusual to us. But I mean, we have, certainly there are boundaries today that are being crossed that people are very uneasy about, like the whole bathroom issues and stuff like that. Where we have men dressing up like women wanting to go into the women's bathroom. And where exactly do you want these people to go? You know what I mean? It's like, I don't mean that as like taking a stand for them, gosh, but it's like, do they belong in the men's bath? You want men dressed up like women in the men's room with your boys? And people always talk in terms of, I don't want them in there with my daughter. It's like, where do we want them? Well, we don't really want them anywhere. I mean, that's generally and that's the problem. It's that they've blurred the lines and the categories, and then people don't know what to do with them. And that's another subject for another time. But so I mean, there's definitely. But what it's saying is, if in Christ we can all be made one because we're all following after one thing. He's enough of a unifying principle